I'd now like to add some validation to make sure that our application is using or receiving the correct data and is able to work with the correct data in the correct formats. And so if we go to our products controller, the point of impact for that kind of thing would be here, where we are deserializing into our data transfer object into our inquiry class. Choose high definition for the best viewing experience, and if you'd like to join a growing group of software developers and take your skills to a new level, all you need to do is subscribe, click the little notification icon, and welcome. However, again, I want to keep this controller fairly light, so I don't want to be throwing a load of validation and checking for errors in here. And also I'm thinking about creating a system which is quite scalable, and so when we perform this deserialization, okay, at this point in time, we just want to validate and make sure that it's receiving the correct kind of data, but there might be a point in future where you actually want more things to happen when you deserialize. You might want to check other things or fire off different pieces of code to do different things. And so for that reason, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a little event listener system so that when we do this deserializing here, okay, in our case we're going to have some kind of listening object which will perform the validation, but it means that in future, if we do want to do other things apart from validation when we deserialize, then we'll have a system which can handle doing those other things. So this should scale really nicely, and it also means we'll be abstracting the detail away from our controller. So, where should this happen? Well, we created our custom serializer. Let's go and have a look at that. We called it DTO serializer, and we have this deserialize method here. Let's create a little bit more room. And so at the moment it's doing one thing, it's just returning the deserialized object. But what I'd like to do is add a hook in here which fires after this deserialization has taken place, and then we can hook into that and have our listener object which can perform the validation, or have other listener objects which can do other things as well. So what we shall do is we shall store this object in a variable called DTO, and then after that deserialization, what we want to do here is fire off the event, and then elsewhere in our application we will have objects which are listening for that event. They will perform the tasks that they need to do. All we're going to do from this deserialize method here is just return that DTO. Now in Symfony there are two ways of listening to events, or the two different types of objects which can listen to events. There are event listeners, which is probably the most loosely coupled system, so you create an event and you can have a bunch of listeners, but then you need to add some configuration which tells the listeners to listen to particular events. Otherwise than listeners, you also have event subscribers. So this is a bit more of a tightly coupled system, because you actually tell the event subscribers which events they are listening to. You actually code it into the event subscriber class. But that is a system that we're going to go with. I think it's going to be fine for our needs, and it means there's one less step we won't have to go through and actually add the configuration. So let's make a start. What I'm going to do is create an event folder inside of source, and inside there we'll create a class, and we'll call this after DTO created event, and this will extend event, and so that is Symfony contracts event dispatcher event. And I'm going to create a constant to have a name which we can use, because when you get the event dispatcher to dispatch events, you have to tell the event dispatcher the name of the event. You have to give the event a name. So public const name equals, and the typical format, or the standard format that you use for this will be what is it followed by what is it doing. And so here it is going to be our DTO, and it will be created, so we're explaining what it is and basically what has happened. You don't have to stick with that, but I'd recommend that you sort of stay with conventions, because it just means that other developers can read your code and sort of understand it, and if we're all on the same page, it just makes life easier for everyone. Okay, so now I'd like my event and my event listeners or my event subscriber to be able to access that DTO. So let's create a constructor. And if you remember, our most highest level DTO was this promotion inquiry interface. So we'll just pass that interface. And because I'm using PHP 8, or I'm using PHP 8.1 as it happens, I can use promoted properties. And so here I'm actually defining the property and setting it at the same time. And then I just want a getter to be able to get this. So fairly straightforward, public function get DTO. That will return a promotion inquiry interface, return this DTO. Now we need to create our event subscriber, which will subscribe to this event. Very important how you name the folder that we put this subscriber in. So you must call it event subscriber. So inside of source, event subscriber, and then inside of there we'll create a class called DTO subscriber. And this needs to implement event subscriber interface, and that comes from Symfony component event dispatcher. And so I get the red squiggly lines. If I hit Alt and Enter on a Mac, then I can add my method stubs. And so here it's telling me to add a method called get subscribed events. If you're not using PHP Storm, you don't have that available to you, then just create this public static function called get subscribed events. And here is where you actually create an array and return an array which lists all the events which this subscriber is subscribed to. And so return, and we want the name of the event as the key, and then as the value we want the actual method which we create in this class which will perform the logic for that particular event. And so our event name is after DTO created event, and we can use our constant, our name constant, which we added to that class. And then the method, let's just have one called validate DTO. And so I'll go and create that now. In here we can automatically inject our event, and we're not going to return anything from here. What we're going to do is we're just going to perform our validation here, and if we get validation errors, I want to throw an exception. Something which I'll quickly explain but I'll not demonstrate yet is that whilst we're doing just the one method here for validation, you can create multiple methods here. So you can create an array of methods which you create in this class, which will all react and respond and perform certain functionality when they hear this event. So when we come and run the test, I'll quickly show that to you. Well, let's get back to the task in hand, and that is to validate the DTO. How are we going to do that? We're going to need the Symfony validator component, which I don't think we have yet. So what I'm going to do is composer require that. So composer require validator. Okay, composer's gone and got that for me, which means that I can create a constructor and inject that. So validator interface, which comes from Symfony component validator, and we can do it all in one step by saying private validator. And then the first thing I need to do is get my DTO. So DTO equals event, and if you remember on our event we added that getter method, get DTO. And then the way validator works is I can say arrows equals validator validate, and then you pass in the object which you are validating, which is our DTO. And then what we want to do is check, do we have any errors? And if we do, I want to throw an exception. So if count errors is greater than 0, then we will throw a new, and I'd like some kind of exception here. If I start typing validation which is sometimes quite a good strategy. You will see something which might appear using Symfony which might be of use to you. And so we've got one here called validation failed exception. Let's go and check out where we are importing that from. So that comes from Symfony component validator exception validation failed exception. So that sounds like it should fit the bill for us. So let's give that a go rather than go and create something ourselves. We'll go and check out its constructor. And so we have one for value, and the other one you'll see is this constraint violation list interface. If we go and look at that, you'll see that this extends traversable, countable and array access interfaces, and that is actually our errors. So our errors will be an instance of constraint violation list. So here for the value property we'll just say validation failed. We're not actually going to use that for anything, but the important part here is the errors. That's our event and that's our subscriber setup. So how are we going to actually check that this works? Ideally, I want to be able to check this in isolation before I go and hook it up to the full service. So what I'm going to do is create a unit test, and there I should be able to check in isolation quite nicely. So down in tests, unit, I'm just going to create a test called DTO subscriber test. And this will extend our service test case. And so we'll have a test called a DTO is validated after it is created, or a DTO is validated after it has been created. So given what is our setup, we're going to need a DTO. Let's use our lowest price inquiry. I'm just going to keep life simple and check one piece of validation. In real life, I've tested to validate everything, but here we just want to really make sure that our system is working. So I'm going to say DTO, and we have this set quantity. So if you remember, we're going to need the quantity pretty much for every single scenario, and so this is a pretty good one to test. And what I'm going to test here is that you can't set the quantity to a negative number. Then we're going to need our event, so event equals new after DTO created event. That takes the DTO as the argument, and then we're going to need to dispatch this event. In order to do that, we're going to need Symfony's event dispatcher. Very important that we get the event dispatcher from the container and we don't just new up an event dispatcher, because if we did that, it means that there would be no connection made between this event and the actual subscribers. And so the way that we can get the event dispatcher from the container, I'll show you a way of actually checking the auto wiring. So I can say Symfony console debug : auto wiring. And then if I just type event dispatcher, you need to have a pretty good idea of what the class names are called, or maybe what the service name is. And so in this case, I know that there is an event dispatcher class or event dispatcher interface. If I hit enter, this is what I get back. And so here are the auto wireable types for event dispatcher, and the part that you see in blue here is the actual name which is used by the container to refer to the event dispatcher. And if you see this here, the event dispatcher interface is a central point of Symfony's event listener system. So important there is the central point. So that is what is making the connection between events and listeners, and events and subscribers. And so we'll grab the container service name here. I'll copy that. You'll see this deprecation notice at the bottom here. Sometimes these are quite useful. So this one is saying user deprecated method, Symfony component event dispatcher, event subscriber interface, get subscribed events, might add array as a native return type declaration in future. Do the same in implementation DTO subscriber now to avoid errors, blah blah blah. And so what he's telling me is that in the future a return type declaration of array might be added for get subscribed events. So it's advising me to do that here. So we'll do that, and then we'll go back to the test. Sorry for the little detour there. And we need an event dispatcher. which I can get from the container like this container get, and then the ID, so the name of that event dispatcher. I'm just going to add a doc block here to get some auto completion, so event dispatcher interface, and then I can add the when part of the test. So when, I'm say event dispatcher dispatch, and if we go and look at this method, we just need to pass the event object. Okay, so that's actually incorrect there, because what happened was when I added event dispatcher interface to this doc block here, I pulled in the wrong one. So it's not PSR event dispatcher interface. What you actually want is the one from Symfony. So it's event dispatcher interface, which is Symfony contracts event dispatcher. And so with the correct one pulled in here, if we go and look at this, you need to pass the event as the first argument and the event name as the second argument. And so you'll see me fix that code in a minute. And what we're going to do here is put an expectation in, an expectation that a validation failed exception will be thrown when this event is dispatched, because it will hit our validate DTO method here in the subscriber, and it should fail validation because we are setting a negative quantity. So we haven't actually set up that validation yet, but that is going to be our flow of events. And so here we can say expect. And the way we can check for expected validation errors is say this expect exception, and then the name of the exception, which is validation failed exception : class. And you can also check for exception messages, which we'll also do, but we need to figure out what that message is going to be first. Let's go over to our lowest price inquiry, and this is where we're going to set up our validation. We can actually do it on each property by adding asserts or adding constraints. Let me show you how we do that. So we're going to use constraints. So this is Symfony component validator constraint as assert, and it is going to be constraints that we use. Let me show you some of those constraints now. So we looked at quantity, that's what we're testing in this one. So the way that you do this is, what I'd like to say is that I don't want a blank quantity to be sent. And for our test, we don't want negative numbers, and there's one actually called positive, which makes sure that the value is positive. Behind the scenes, I'm just going to put in some extra constraints for some of the other properties. And so this is what I've come up with, just a bit of validation added to some of the properties which will be set mainly during deserialization, and the ones which will get set by the modifiers, I've just left them alone just to keep life simple for this exercise. Okay, and so when validate is called, our validate method, which we have in the validate DTO method in our subscriber, then all of those constraints will be checked, and if any of them fail, then it will be added to the constraint violation list, i.e. our errors array which we are creating here. And like I said, as well as checking which exceptions to expect, you can also check the message. So if we go back to our lowest price inquiry and we just click on this positive constraint here, it says that the message is this value should be positive, and so that will be our exception message, or that will make up part of our exception message if this particular constraint fails. So let's copy that, and in our test we'll also check the message with expect exception message. And with that, I think we're okay to go and run our test. So vendor bin PHP unit test unit DTO subscriber test.php. Okay, and so we have a failure, and the reason for that failure actually is that I've done this wrong. So here when we dispatch, we need to dispatch the event, but we also need to provide it the name of the event. So event and then I can call that constant directly off my event object there. If I go and run this again, hopefully this is going to pass. Okay, so we get one test, two assertions. Just a couple of things to point out. This message here, it doesn't need to match exactly. For example, it just needs to match a part of the message. So if I removed some of this and just had a couple of words, this should still pass. Okay, so this just needs to be found inside of the full message. If you haven't already checked out my Testing PHP course, then I'll leave a link in the description, but I'll go through loads of stuff like this, handling exceptions in tests and pretty much anything you want to do with PHP tests in the course. So like I say, I'll leave a link in the description, but for now, if you remember what I said when we created our DTO subscriber, and I said you can have other methods which are actually listening for this event. So let's go and give that a try now. So what you need to do is create an array inside of this array, and then there for each one, because there is going to be more than one. If you leave it as default, if I just added another method, then they will be called in subsequent order, but then you can also give them points, and the one with the highest points will get called before others. It's a priority. So if I gave this a priority of 100, shall we say, so we need to then put this in an array itself. If we give this a priority of 100 and then we create another method, I'll just call it do something else. If we give that a priority of 1, then it will be the validate DTO method which gets called first. We'll go and add that do something else method, and in here we'll just dump out doing something else. Now at the moment, because of the way that this is working, because a validation exception is thrown here, we won't actually even hit this method, but we'll go and run it anyway. Okay, so as you can see, the tests run as per usual, and we're not actually hitting this method. But if we change the priorities of these and we make this 100 and then we make this 1, it means that this one will be called first, and so we should dump out this here. So let's go and run this. Okay, cool, and so that's what happens. Yeah, and so basically what I'm just saying there is when this event is fired, you can have multiple methods on this subscriber which will react and respond to that event. But I'm going to put this back the way that it was because we only need our validation, but I was just showing you how this works and how you can actually perform more than one action when you listen to particular events. We'll go back and run the tests again, so we're finishing on a green test, and we'll run all the tests again. So I'd recommend you do that if you've been working on a particular test and just running one test in isolation. Make sure you haven't broken anything else, and so there we just run all the tests, everything is working. And now all that remains is to plug this into our DTO serializer and then take it for a test drive. So I shall create a event dispatcher property, so private, and this will be event dispatcher interface. Again, make sure you get the right one. So this comes from Symfony contracts event dispatcher, and we'll call that event dispatcher also. Inject that through our constructor, so event dispatcher, and then just set the property. So this event dispatcher equals event dispatcher. Down to our deserialize method. So here there's two things we need to do. We need to create the event and we need to dispatch the event. So first off, event equals new. After DTO created event, then we pass in our DTO and then we simply dispatch it. So just underneath this comment, this event dispatcher dispatch, first argument is the actual event, the second argument is the actual event name. So just following the steps in this deserialize method here, we deserialize into the DTO, we create the event passing in the DTO as a single constructor argument, and then we dispatch the event, and we know that we'll have our event subscriber listening for that. So next we need to go over to Postman, and we're just going to fire off our request. So here I'm expecting validation to pass because all of these look good, so we'll send off that. Okay, and so we get a status 200, everything's set, everything's working. Let's make our validation fail. So here I'm going to set quantity to -5, send this off. Big explosion, which is good. So this doesn't look very nice, it's all quite ugly, but it's doing what we want it to do, because if you see what the actual problem is, it says that this value should be positive. So our validation is working. It's saying Symfony component validator exception, validation failed exception. So even though this doesn't look great, it's perfect, it's doing exactly what we need it to do. But we're going to make this a lot more graceful, and so error handling is something that we're going to work on next. If you've enjoyed this video and you'd like YouTube to show you more of my content, all you need to do is subscribe and click the notification icon. And also, if you're interested in my full-length courses, then make sure you check out my site at garyclarke.tech. I'll leave a link on the screen and in the description.